There was something off about the way she moved through that hallway. Not wrong, not suspicious, just off in the way that makes a person slow down for half a second before they can name what caught their eye. Orderly Darnell Hayes noticed it first, and later, when reporters were asking everyone what they remembered, he'd be the only one honest enough to say he saw it before any of it happened. He'd been pushing a linen cart down the west corridor of the Veterans Recovery Wing at Whitmore Regional Medical Center when he spotted her, a nurse he didn't recognize, mid-30s. Moving with the kind of deliberate quiet that wasn't hurried but wasn't casual either. She was simply present in the space the way most people aren't, like she was reading the hallway the same way she was walking through it, taking in everything without looking like she was taking in anything. He almost said something, almost asked if she needed directions. He didn't, and later he'd say he wasn't sure why. Her badge clipped to the breast pocket of her blue scrubs read L. Carver, RN in small black letters. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a low bun, a few strands loose against her jaw from what had clearly been a long shift. She wore a simple silver wristwatch, analog, not smart, the kind that doesn't need to be charged. There was a faint redness along the tops of her cheekbones that might have been the recycled hospital air, or might have been exhaustion, or both. Her eyes, when she checked the door number against the chart folder she carried, were a pale, particular shade of blue-gray that caught the fluorescent light in a way that made her look briefly older than she was. She stopped at room 7 West, checked the number again, then pushed the door open slowly, carefully, and stepped inside. If you've ever worked in a hospital or love someone who has, stay with this story, because what happened in the next 2 hours is about something that doesn't get talked about enough. Room 7 West was a restricted recovery room in the post-surgical observation corridor of Whitmore's Veterans Services Unit. It wasn't a place a general floor nurse wandered into by accident. The corridor itself required badge access at 2 separate checkpoints, and the wing's patient census was considered sensitive, a designation carried over from a federal partnership the hospital had entered with the VA 18 months prior. The patients housed there were often active or recently discharged service members, some recovering from surgeries conducted under non-public circumstances, some transferred from military medical facilities for specialized civilian care. The man in room 7 West was sedated. He'd been in that state for going on 36 hours. His name wasn't on the public patient board. His wristband identified him by a 4-digit code rather than a last name, which was not unusual for this unit but was still something the nursing staff absorbed quietly and moved past without asking questions. He was connected to a ventilator, a cardiac monitor, and a slow IV drip of fentanyl citrate that kept his body from registering the aggressive healing happening in his left thoracic cavity. His color was poor. His vitals, while stable, had been hovering at the low end of stable since morning. Nurse Carver stood at the foot of his bed for a long moment before she moved. She didn't touch anything first. She read the monitors. Not glanced, read, the way someone reads a page they've read before and are checking for changes. Her eyes moved across the cardiac display, dropped to the respiratory rate, came back up to the oxygen saturation. Then she moved to the IV stand and checked the drip rate with 2 fingers on the line, a tactile check that most nurses didn't bother with if the pump was running clean. She leaned slightly to look at the insertion site on his forearm, gently lifted the tape edge with a thumbnail without fully peeling it, resettled it. Then she looked at his face. She stood there quietly for a moment that stretched out past professional observation. It wasn't grief, it wasn't sentimentality. It was something quieter and harder to name. The particular stillness of a person who has looked at someone injured before, who has done so many times, who has learned to look at a wounded person without letting the looking break them. That kind of stillness takes a long time to learn. It takes a specific kind of history to carry it this well. She was writing a note in the chart when the door opened behind her. His name was Craig Mercer, and he ran the Veterans Services Administrative Office with the particular confidence of someone who had been told his judgment was excellent for so long he'd stopped questioning it. He was 43, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested former athletic ambition rather than current fitness, and wore the kind of sport coat over a collared shirt that management staff often wore in hospitals to signal authority without triggering patient-facing dress codes. He had a laminated badge with a gold-edged stripe, the color coding for senior administration, and he used it the way some people use a held door, as the opening gesture of a negotiation he'd already decided he'd won. He saw Nurse Carver at the bedside. He stopped. He looked at her badge, back at her face, back at her badge. "This room is restricted," he said. His voice was even, practiced, the tone of someone who delivered unpleasant information regularly and had developed a coding over the edges. "Who authorized your access?" She didn't turn around immediately, finished the notation she was writing, capped the pen, then turned. "Dr. Fessler asked me to check in on the respiratory rate trend," she said. Her voice was low, unhurried, the way a person speaks when they're trying not to disturb a sedated patient. "It's been flagging at the low end of the acceptable range." He wanted eyes on. Mercer looked at the sedated man in the bed, then back at her. "Dr. Fessler's off shift. He doesn't have authority to direct nursing staff to restricted units after handoff. He messaged me directly. Show me a beat." She looked at him with those pale eyes and said quietly, "It's on my personal phone. I'd have to step out to get it. Then step out and wait there. I'll need to verify with the charge nurse." She moved toward the door without argument, without irritation, without the defensive physical language most people default to when they feel accused of something they haven't done. She simply moved toward the door the same way she'd moved through the hallway, reading everything, reacting to none of it. Just before she reached Mercer's position, she glanced back once at the patient's cardiac monitor. One glance. Then she stepped out into the corridor. Mercer followed her out. He pulled the door shut behind him and reached for his radio. Darnell Hayes, still nearby with his linen cart, watched from the end of the hallway. The charge nurse on duty was a woman named Pam Kowalski, who had been working this unit for 11 years. She arrived quickly when Mercer radioed, and she looked at Nurse Carver with the cautious, measuring expression of someone who'd been through this kind of situation before. Not this specific situation, but the general shape of it. Staff member in an unauthorized zone. Administrator wanting resolution. "Do you recognize this nurse?" Mercer asked. Pam studied the badge. "Carver. I've seen her on the general surgical floor. She's not assigned to this unit." "Correct." Mercer turned back to Nurse Carver with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has just been handed the paperwork he needed. "I'm going to need you to go back to your assigned floor while I look into this. If Dr. Fessler made a request through improper channels, that's a separate issue, but you shouldn't be in this corridor." Nurse Carver looked at him with an expression that was not offense and was not submission. It was something flatter and harder, the expression of a person who has been managed poorly before and knows exactly what it looks like and has simply decided not to give it the reaction it's fishing for. "Understood," she said. She didn't move immediately. She looked at the closed door of room 7 West, then at the cardiac telemetry readout mounted on the wall panel outside the room, the external display that mirrored the bedside monitor. The saturation number on the screen had dropped 2 points since she'd come out. She looked at Mercer. "His sat is trending down. Someone should be in there." Mercer didn't look at the panel. "The unit nursing staff will manage it." "The unit nursing staff is 1 person for 4 rooms right now. I just came from—" "Thank you, Ms. Carver." He used the Ms. like a correction. "Security will walk you out." 2 hospital security officers had appeared at the far end of the corridor, already moving toward her at Mercer's signal. Not running, walking with the deliberate pace of people who'd done a dozen of these removals and considered it routine. The taller one had his radio unclipped. Nurse Carver looked at them, then at Pam. Pam looked at the floor. She looked one more time at the telemetry panel. Then she turned and walked toward the security officers on her own before they reached her, quietly, no dramatics, no raised voice. Darnell Hayes watched her go, and later he'd say what stuck with him was not what she said or how she looked, but the way she glanced once, briefly, at the patient's door as she passed it, not with anger, not with defeat, with the expression of someone leaving a post they were ordered to leave and knowing what it might cost. He'd say it made him feel like he was watching something wrong. He just didn't know yet what the name for it was. The security escort took her as far as the elevator bank at the end of the corridor. The taller officer, his badge read D. Paulson, pressed the down button without looking at her. The other stood to her left. It was the geometry of administrative removal, polite, impersonal, final. The elevator arrived. And so did the K9 unit. They came from the stairwell at the other end of the corridor, 3 of them, moving fast and in formation. The handler in front was a large, square man in his early 40s wearing a dark tactical vest over a civilian shirt, a federal identification card clipped to the front and a leash in his left hand. The dog at his side was a Belgian Malinois, lean, high alert, ears forward, scanning the corridor with the particular thoroughness of a working animal that trusts its training more than its instincts. The two men behind the handler were in similar kit, hands loose at their sides, watching the hallway ends. This was not a routine hospital security check. They were here for Room 7 West. Someone had flagged a possible threat vector connected to the patient housed there, a credible intelligence concern that had been escalating over the past 6 hours and had reached the level that warranted a federal law enforcement response. The handler's name was Agent Marcus Webb, and he'd been briefed on the patient and the room and the layout of the corridor. He had not been briefed on the nurse. Mercer stepped forward, instinctively assuming the role of the authority figure who manages arrivals. He extended his badge. Craig Mercer, Senior Administrator, Veteran Services. This is a secure unit. I'll need to see your authorization before... Federal case number is on file with your security director, Webb said, not breaking stride. His eyes swept the corridor. We need access to 7 West and a perimeter on the exit points. Pam Kowalski stepped aside. The security officers had both turned toward the new arrivals, pulled from their routine by the shift in the corridor's energy. And then something happened that Darnell Hayes would describe with precision in every conversation afterward, because he was at exactly the right angle to see it. Agent Webb passed the elevator bank. His dog tracked ahead, professional and automatic. And then the dog did something Darnell had never seen a working animal do in an active sweep. It stopped. The Malinois stopped, turned its head, and looked directly at Nurse Carver, who was still standing near the open elevator, held loosely in the custody of the 2 security officers. The dog didn't bark, didn't lunge. It just looked at her with the intense, focused regard of an animal that recognizes something it has been trained to respond to. Webb felt the lead change. He stopped, turned, and went absolutely still. Later, Agent Webb would say that he didn't recognize her face first. It was the posture, the particular way she stood even in a coercive situation. Weight evenly distributed, shoulders level, hands loose, not aggressive, not submissive, aligned. The posture of someone who has trained themselves over a long time to take up exactly as much space as the situation requires and no more. He'd seen that posture in one context, in one person, once. "Excuse me," he said. He was looking at her. The corridor had gone quiet in the way the corridors go quiet when something shifts in them, not silence, but a lowering of ambient noise as people unconsciously stop moving. "Can I ask your name?" she told him. "Nurse Carver, room assignment, general surgical floor." He stared for another second, then he looked at the chart folder still under her arm, then at her wristwatch, that analog wristwatch with the scratched crown and the particular type of band that isn't sold at department stores. He said, very carefully, "What unit?" And she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time with the focused attention she'd been applying to everything else in the corridor, and something in her face shifted. Not surprise, more like recognition that didn't fully want to surface. "Sir," one of the security officers said to Webb, "this individual was in the process of being escorted from—" "Hold on!" Webb didn't look at the officer. He was still watching her face. "I need to see your chart note, the one you were writing in 7 West. Mercer stepped forward. "Agent, that's a restricted patient chart, and this staff member was unauthorized in—" "Can you show me the note?" Webb asked her again. Quiet, direct, like there were no other people in the hallway. She looked at Mercer, then back at Webb, then she opened the chart folder and held it out. He took it. Read the notation she'd written. His jaw moved once. Then he looked at the bottom of the page where beneath the clinical observations, respiratory rate trend IV insertion site condition. Recommended reassessment of drip rate. She'd written a 4-digit incident classification code that wasn't part of any civilian nursing standard. It was a field assessment notation, the kind used in forward operating environments where the person writing it needed to communicate patient status to multiple responders in under 3 seconds. Webb had only seen that notation used by one kind of person. He looked up at her. "What's your call sign?" he said. The hallway held its breath. Pam Kowalski, who had been watching from 6 feet away and would later say she didn't understand what she was seeing, described the moment like this. The nurse's expression didn't change, but something in the air around her did. The way the air changes when a window opens in a sealed room and you feel the pressure shift before you feel the actual air. Nurse Carver said it, quietly, 2 words. A call sign that had appeared on a classified after-action report filed 4.5 years ago in connection with a border operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. An operation in which a 6-person combat rescue unit had entered a collapsed perimeter under active fire to extract 2 injured federal agents and a working dog. An operation in which the team leader, a woman with combat trauma training and field surgical certification, operating far beyond her designated role that night, had kept 2 people alive long enough to matter. Webb handed the chart folder back. Then he stepped back, and he brought his right hand up to his forehead in a full, rigid, deliberate salute, the kind you only render to someone who has earned it, the kind that doesn't come with an explanation because the explanation is already inside the gesture. The corridor processed this information at different speeds. Darnell Hayes understood it immediately, not the details but the weight. He'd grown up with veterans. He knew what that salute meant and who it was for. Pam Kowalski understood it slower. A nurse, a call sign, a field notation she didn't recognize, a federal agent's deference. And when the pieces landed, she felt something she later described as shame, which surprised her because she hadn't done anything cruelly wrong. She'd just looked at her floor at the wrong moment. Mercer didn't understand it at all, and in the absence of understanding, his first instinct was administration, to reframe the situation around procedure, to note that whatever prior relationship this agent had with this nurse, it didn't change the access protocol to manage the moment back into something he could document and process and absorb without reorganizing what it meant about his actions 4 minutes ago. He didn't get the chance to do that. Webb had already turned to the security officers. "She's cleared. Step back." "Sir, the administrative directive." "She's cleared," Webb repeated. The tone wasn't loud. It was the tone of a statement rather than a request, the tone of someone who has made their last concession on this particular point. The security officer stepped back. Webb looked at Mercer. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, the notation in that chart identified a potential oxygen saturation drift before your on-unit staff had flagged it. That patient is connected to an active federal case. A pause. "I'd like to understand what authority you used to remove the person who caught that." Mercer's mouth opened, closed. "That's something we should probably discuss in writing," Webb added. "I'll need the chain of command above your position." Nurse Carver went back into room 7 West. She didn't announce it. She didn't wait for permission. She picked up the chart folder from where she'd been holding it, and she walked back down the corridor to the door, and she pushed it open, and she went inside. Webb followed as far as the doorway and held it half open with one hand. The patient's saturation had dropped another point. It hadn't crossed into critical yet, but the trend line on the monitor had taken on the particular downward slope that suggests accumulation rather than fluctuation. Nurse Carver had his chart open and was already cross-referencing the ventilator pressure settings against the most recent blood gas values from 4 hours ago. She worked without narrating, without performance. The Malinois sat in the doorway beside his handler, watching her with the calm attentiveness of an animal that has already decided. Webb looked at the dog, then at the nurse. There was a family in the waiting room down the hall. The patient's daughter, her husband, their 12-year-old son who'd been sitting with his back against the wall for 2 days reading a paperback that he wasn't actually reading. They'd been told nothing except that their father was stable. They'd watched the commotion in the corridor with the tight, anxious silence of people who've learned to interpret hospital energy rather than hospital words. The daughter, her name was Renata, had watched through the window of the waiting room when Webb saluted. She didn't know what it meant about the nurse's history. She didn't know about the call sign or the operation or the field classification notation. But she'd spent 2 days watching nurses pass her father's door with varying degrees of attention, and she had formed the opinion that held exactly precisely. The shape of what she was watching now, someone who actually sees the person in that room. She came out into the corridor while Mercer was still standing there looking reduced. She looked at the closed door of room 7 West. Then at Webb. "Who is she?" Renata asked. Webb thought about how to answer that. "She's someone who's good at this," he said. "At all of it." The administrative review that followed wasn't dramatic. Mercer wasn't fired that day or that week. The hospital's compliance office opened a file. A notation went into his personnel record regarding the failure to consult the attending physician before initiating a removal in a clinical setting. It was the kind of consequence that doesn't feel sufficient from the outside and feels enormous from the inside, the kind that rewrites the future without obliterating the present. He knew from the moment Webb asked for the chain of command that the room had realigned without him, that whatever authority he'd walked into that corridor with, he'd walked out with less of it, that the particular architecture of the moment, federal agent, salute, call sign, patient, sat trend, that chart notation he hadn't understood and couldn't argue with would be the story people told when they described that day. His version of it would not be the version that circulated. Nurse Carver stayed in room 7 West for another hour and 20 minutes. She adjusted the ventilator pressure settings after consulting by phone with the attending intensivist. She documented a revised monitoring protocol. She updated the chart with a detailed trend notation that the overnight nursing staff would find and understand immediately. The saturation stabilized, moved back up by 4 points over 40 minutes, then held. When she came out of the room, Webb was still in the corridor. His team had completed their sweep. The dog was at his feet, watchful and calm. She handed the chart to Pam Kowalski, who took it with both hands and said quietly, "Thank you." Nurse Carver nodded. "Just once." Webb walked with her toward the elevator. They didn't speak for most of it. At the elevator bank, he said, without looking at her, "You never came back." She pressed the button, watched the numbers descend. "I'm here," she said. It wasn't a contradiction. It wasn't reassurance. It was just true. She was here, whatever she'd carried out of that border operation, and from the way she said it, Webb understood there was a great deal she'd carried out of it, more than she'd deposited anywhere. She was still here, still showing up to the corridor, still reading the monitors, still catching the drift before it became a drop. The elevator opened. She stepped in, turned. The doors began to close, and in the last second before they did, Webb raised his hand again, not the rigid formal salute of the corridor, but a simpler thing, one palm up. Acknowledgement. She looked at him through the narrowing gap, and then the doors met and she was gone. Darnell Hayes went home that evening and sat for a while before he could explain to his wife what had unsettled him about his shift. It wasn't the federal agents or the dog or the administrator's quiet humiliation. It was what he'd seen first, before all of it, before any of it made sense. A woman moving through a corridor with a quality of attention he hadn't seen before and couldn't immediately name. He named it later, lying in the dark, watching the ceiling fan turn. The word was vigilance, the particular kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that has survived enough to stop needing anyone to notice it and keep showing up anyway in blue scrubs with a silver wristwatch because the work is the work and someone has to read the monitors. He thought about the way she'd looked back at room 7 West as she was being escorted out. He thought about how a person learns to look at someone who's hurting without letting the looking break them. He thought it probably took a very long time and a very specific kind of life. And he thought, lying there in the dark while the fan turned and his wife breathed quietly beside him, that he hoped she was sleeping, wherever she was, whoever she'd been, whatever she was still carrying. He hoped she was finally sleeping. Some people carry their whole history in the way they hold a pen, in the way they check a tape edge without being told to, in the way they look at a door when they're being walked away from it. Most of us never learn to read those details. Most of us walk past them every day. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt true about the people you've overlooked or underread or quietly dismissed, consider sharing it. Not because the algorithm needs it, because someone you know might need to be reminded that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who has seen the most. And if there's a story in your life that carries this kind of weight, leave it below. The hallway is still listening.